Hello, people. Um, the last live that I did about the Helgstrand situation got a lot of views, so I wanted to do another one now that more people have probably been able to at least see some of the footage or some of the photos from that situation. Um, and I also want to talk about like the process of how people even get to the point of abusing horses like that, because I think a lot of people are naive in thinking that only like evil, malicious, like villainous people can do that, and they'll label them as monsters and they'll make efforts to dehumanize the person instead of realizing that like anyone can become someone like that, and that it's a multi-step process, and that there's a lot of attitudes in and out of the horse world that encourage and enable people to abuse animals to that point. Um, it starts with small things, like it's little things, even just like the fact that double bridles are compulsory at the upper levels, spurs are compulsory at the upper levels. Um, the bits that are allowed to legally be sold at tack stores, the types of tack and equipment that's legally allowed to be sold at tack stores, the disconnect from how the tack and equipment that we use impacts our horses. For those people asking about the Helgstrand documentary, it's only on Danish TV right now, so you need to have a VPN, and I think you also need to pay a subscription fee. It's going to get released to everyone at some point, I'm certain. But yeah, it's only available then. But basically, to summarize, he abused whips and spurs to the point of leaving welts and sores on horses. Lots of roll cur, which isn't a surprise because he's literally been caught in public doing that. And stuff that honestly is not so shocking and unique that he's the only one guilty of this. And that's, I think, the bigger issue with the documentary is the fact that this is very common behavior that we see across the horse world. And people are only freaking out now because he got caught. What I also want to point out is that a lot of people abuse bits and spurs. And if they don't leave visible marks on their horse, people let it slide. They won't take issue with spurs in the same way unless there's visible marks. And I think that the fact that as a community we need stuff to get to the point where there is visible abuse marks before we really care and before we label it as a problem, I think speaks for a lot of the attitudes in the horse world that enable this type of behavior. And what I also want to point out is that this doesn't just stop at abuse towards horses. Over the last several years, for anyone who's followed equestrian news, I'm sure you can recall how many really prevalent upper level trainers have been caught sexually assaulting their students. So the abuse is multifaceted. It is not just directed at horses. And also the horses that we actually see being abused and the people that actually come forward and talk about their abuse are just the tip of the iceberg. They're just the ones that were able to be caught in the case of horses, be caught by a reporter, or in the case of people that are willing to step forward and share their abuse. And there's so many things in the horse world that people don't bat an eye at that enable this very type of behavior. And it's the type of stuff that people shit all over people like me for pointing out and get really angry with me. Like if you go back and look at any of the welfare posts I've posted about bits, about roll cur, about anything, the comments are filled with people insisting that not everyone's guilty of it and personally attacking me. And here's the thing. When we fixate on not everyone being guilty of something, it implies that in order for something to matter enough to actually do something, that everyone needs to be guilty of it, that it needs to be such a prevalent problem in the industry that the majority of people are engaging in it. And that's really stupid because it doesn't really matter if it's everyone or not. We should still care about making a difference. And someone like Helgstrand is just the one upper level rider that got caught in the overt way that he did. He's just the one upper level rider so far that has had an undercover journalist go and catch what he did on video. And he's now doing damage control, of course, and insisting that he wasn't aware of what's going on. But here's the thing, like he's been caught doing stuff that's consistent with what we saw in the video in public. He's roll curd horses in public. And this is the other problem that I want people to start acknowledging truthfully. Judges and stewards are in on the abuse, even if it's just out of them being afraid to speak out, even if they're just afraid of repercussions from whoever they would have to be barring from competition or exposing. Even if that's the only reason they stay silent, they are in on it. They are complicit. This is not a secret. It has not been a secret. And he has gotten away with it for years. And the fact that it took this long to catch this man in a way where he has been exposed to the point of finally getting dropped from the Olympic team is an absolute embarrassment for our industry. And the other thing that I want to touch on is um that in our industry there's like such a like idolization of upper level professionals to the point where we let them get off with smaller infractions that are usually indicators of bigger things going on behind the scenes simply because of who they are. They operate on a different set of rules. And this also plays into what I'm referencing about the corruption. Upper level riders don't get held accountable in the same way that any other non-famous rider would if they were caught doing literally the same thing. If you saw someone at a lower level dressage show like roll curring their horse in the warm-up ring, people wouldn't be okay with it, but they're willing to justify and make excuses for people at the upper levels. The next thing I want to point out is that during the Paris Welfare Summit that I was in attendance of, a judge, an FEI judge, an Olympic level FEI judge, openly supported a form of roll current hyperflexion that is LDR, and it has been proven to be damaging to welfare. And he openly on live stream, knowing he was getting filmed, knowing that his position was public, supported it. And that is just what they're willing to say publicly. So what I would really like for people to start doing is actually openly start talking about this stuff and stop being so protective of the horse sport that you're willing to enable and basically condone abuse out of fear of the sport being dismantled or canceled. Because the only reason that that's even on the table as a risk now is because of our lack of ability to address all of these problems earlier. The only reason it's ever going to get to that point, if it does, is because of our apathy and our lack of ability to address the problems earlier and waiting until the problems become so publicized that the public jumps in and gets involved and tries to cancel the sport. That is what puts the sport at risk of being canceled. And it's really foolish and also just selfish. Like, I think the other thing we need to unpack is if you value the sport so much that you're willing to continue allowing abuse to occur without holding people accountable, without talking about it knowingly, and just continue going about your business because you want to keep showing, there's no denying that the sport comes before the horse then. Like, if you don't care about horse welfare to the point where you're like, yeah, I know there's problems going on, but what about the sport? What if the sport gets canceled? What if it does get canceled? We deserve to get canceled if we don't address these things. Like, I'm going to be completely honest. The sport deserves to go under if we keep doing this. We're literally digging our own grave. We're digging our own grave. We're building a freaking coffin to put the industry in. And we're making it as public as possible because people are so apathetic and so in denial that they don't want to address these things until they're so public that everyone gets involved. Because you can bet that that documentary is going to be seen by people outside of the horse world. And they're going to be so much more appalled than the average person in the horse world because they've not been indoctrinated and desensitized in the same way that we have. And these abuses start small. Like, a lot of people do get into horses because they love them, but then they're enabled in using harmful equipment, riding perpetually stressed horses and shrugging off their stress as quirks, excitement, or whatever. And it builds to the point where you can then justify doing these horrible things. People don't go into the sport just immediately starting to spur their horses to the point of creating sores on them. It's slowly built over time, and you desensitize yourself to it, and then you start to enable it again and again and again, over and over again. And this is where I don't agree with people who say that it's nitpicky to address the smaller forms of abuse. Because there's a big difference between something that's a mistake, and even then, if you make a mistake that's really harmful towards welfare, there's opportunity for you to change, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't get held accountable for it. You should get held accountable. You should, at the bare minimum, be told that what you're doing is wrong and have to sit with that, knowing that wrong, and deal with it. And then you can grow and change and show people that you've become better. But we need to start addressing the smaller wrongs too. We can't just wait until someone's roll curring a horse and spurring it to the point of creating sores before we're like, oh yeah, that's wrong. Because there's tons of riders who are doing the exact same training tactics in less obvious ways, less overt ways, and getting away with it. Because the other thing I want to point out is that someone like Andreas Helgstrand being so bold and willing to ride in hyperflexion at a horse show out in the open in the warm-up ring speaks for what he would be willing to do behind the scenes. Like, you don't even really need to see a documentary to assume that if someone has the audacity to do very abusive things right in the public eye, when they know they're on video, when they know there's tons of people watching, they're going to be doing worse behind the scenes, because there's going to be things that they know they can't get away with in public that they're going to be afraid to do. And a lot of riders are guilty of this. And what I want to also point out that's going to piss people off is a lot of your favorites that you regard as good welfare, excellent trainers are also complicit. They know this stuff is going on. They just don't say anything. They care more about their position in the sport and not rocking the boat than they do about doing the right thing. And this can be said about basically everyone in the world. Like, a lot of people care more about their day-to-day life remaining the same, separating themselves from conflict, than they do about doing the right thing, which is why we have the bystander effect, where people can be standing around watching horrible things happen and they do nothing, because it has become so pervasive and enabled in our society, because people think they're entitled to constant comfort and not having to acknowledge any type of mistreatment or discomfort. People care so much about maintaining that constant comfort that they're basically willing to look the other way and put blinders on and pretend that something's not an issue. But here's the thing. Every time you ignore a problem, it grows, it gets bigger, and eventually that problem is going to snowball and it's going to impact you in your day-to-day life. So it's like, would you rather step in and deal with a smaller problem in the beginning, or wait until it blows up and deal with a huge problem in the end? Like, these are the things. And this is also how I view like humanitarian violations, because if we're willing to stand by and watch other people in different areas get abused because we're like, oh, it's not in my backyard, and not say anything, then eventually when things snowball to the point where you might end up one of the targets of discrimination and mistreatment, you're going to be whining and crying and being like, why is no one helping me? How did it get to this point? This is such an injustice. It's so unfair. And to be frank, you don't really deserve people to step in and advocate for you if you never did it for them. But they still will. The people who speak out the most still will step in and advocate for you. But if we let things get to the point where we're literally basically like up against a wall and our consequences are coming right at us 100 miles an hour, it's way harder to get out of that situation. And this is what's going to happen to the sport. If we don't learn from this and we don't become consistently holding more riders accountable and openly saying that certain things are abusive and not enabling certain products to be sold, not enabling certain practices to be proudly shared online, and have people laughing and joking and blowing up videos where horses are having a very bad time and have terrible welfare in the videos. We need to stop doing that, because eventually it's going to push us up against a wall where we have all of these animal rights people who will literally have a point. They'll 100% have a point and a reason to go after us. And then at that point, when we've gone on so long being apathetic, refusing to look at scientific evidence showing us what we're doing wrong, refusing to speak out, refusing to do anything, no one is going to believe that we will change when you suddenly wait until you've been that exposed to go, oh, no, we'll change. We can do better. We've learned. And like, essentially, that's what Helgstrand's doing right now with his damage control, where he's like, welfare is so important. We're making necessary changes in the barn to better welfare, blah, 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 blah. And that's what he's doing now that he's got his back against the wall and that he's been put in a position where he has to basically do damage control. But at this point, it's like, what has happened to his reputation is so damaging that it's going to be so hard to completely undo for the whole industry in the way that he was able to get away with before. He's not going to be able to go back to where he was before. And the same applies to the industry as a whole if we don't address these things. So it starts off with people mocking and making fun of horses who are being stressed and who are not having a good time, downplaying the damage that the training aids and bits that they use are, using slippery slope arguments to try to deflect from what are relevant welfare points. I'm going to use an example. I've done a number of posts on really harsh bits and why they shouldn't be legal. And I specify that I'm talking about really harsh bits, and I use photos of the bits, like styles that I'm referencing. And people will go, oh, like they're just going to ban all bits, or you want to ban all bits. Like, oh, bitless can be bad too. And their entire MO is deflecting from the point that I actually made, instead of accepting the fact that, yes, there are bits currently being sold on the market that are legal to use in certain competition rings that are damaging to horse welfare. Full stop. And again, it's a slippery slope argument where it's like, oh, if we do this one thing to promote welfare in horses, then it's going to snowball and end up banning the piece of equipment as a whole. And again, I think that's one of the stupidest arguments people can have, because what's going to end up having bits banned as a whole is going to be the flagrant imagery that we have everywhere, painted all over the FEI pages, posted over all major show venues. The riders post them. The videos of horses gaping their mouths, blue tongues, horses hanging their tongues out of the mouth, biting their tongues and having bloody mouths. It's going to be those things that lead people to wanting bits banned. But if people actually take the initiative to be like, look, there's some things going on that aren't very okay. What can we do to fix these? Then it's less likely to snowball to that point, because it shows that we're actually making changes with new information. And personally, what I see in and out of the horse world is people are so wanting to just keep themselves comfortable and go about their day-to-day lives without issue and not have to deal with anything difficult, that they are willing to continue enabling toxic behaviors that we need to eradicate from society. And yes, in the beginning, it is very hard to speak out against toxicity when so much of the industry you're involved in is toxic, and so many of them are either directly participating in the abusive behavior or are watching it happen and not doing anything, and won't advocate for you if you start getting torn apart by the people who are abusing. And it's very hard to speak out in the beginning, but the more people do it, the easier it becomes. The more people who start advocating for welfare, the more space it is for people to join in and be safer and not get torn apart to the extent that people such as myself are, for posting things that are so taboo to talk about still, that it inevitably infuriates people. And the more people that talk, the safer the community becomes. But as it stands now, I see so many toxic patterns that we enable in horse care and training, and also towards people, and it does not serve anyone. It enables people in engaging in abusive behaviors towards the animals that they love, and also towards each other, because there's coercion and manipulation tactics used by trainers and and even media companies to try to shut people up and basically shame them into no longer saying anything, and basically coerce you into no longer saying anything. And it's scary to deal with. Like, honestly, like, to again, like, I referenced this in the last live, so it's a little redundant, but in France at the welfare summit that I was at, what the FEI director of solidarity approached the woman who was putting on the summit, the owner of Collectif pour les Chevaux, and asked her to take me off the panel and silence me and just gag me because he didn't like what I was saying. And to point out what I was saying is what he really didn't like, because he left during the middle of my speech. Very rude, but anyways, grown men can be whiny babies too. What he didn't like is that they were talking about the FEI welfare code of conduct and talking about it in a way that's like, look at all these great incentives that we have to promote welfare. And on paper, the code of conduct is great, but they're not upholding it. Like, I'll pull it up and I'll read it in a second. But they aren't actually upholding what the code of conduct says. It's not actually being enforced and put into place. And by their own definition of what the welfare code of conduct says, they are breaking it and having horses that are actively in negative welfare states competing in competition that they're allowing to happen, and that they're boldly posting on their social page and supporting. So what I did is I added a slide to my slideshow right after this speech and talked about gaslighting and how there's certain manipulation tactics in trying to basically silence people and make them feel like they are in the wrong, or that they're witnessing things incorrectly, so that they no longer advocate for the horses. And I cited what they said about their welfare code of conduct, and then pointed out all the ways that they're in violation of their own code of conduct, and said that it's gaslighting to claim that they are upholding this code of conduct when they are not doing it. and they did not like that. So I'm going to pull up the code of conduct right now. So 1 second. It's actually ridiculous. It's honestly almost laughable. It's almost like satire when you read this and you go look what's going on in the horse competition ring. Okay, so this is the opening paragraph for it. The FEI requires all of those involved in international equestrian sport to adhere to the FEI code of conduct and to acknowledge and accept that at all times the welfare of the horse must be paramount. Welfare of the horse must never be subordinated to competitive or commercial influences. Now, right there, that's the first sentence, or the first two sentences. They're already in violation of their own code of conduct because welfare of the horse is at every competition they host. It's subordinated to competitive and commercial influences, and they openly enable it. But anyways, we'll go into it. So, there are training methods. Horses must only undergo training that matches their physical capabilities and level of maturity for their respective disciplines. They must not be subjected to methods which are abusive or cause fear. Do you want to know how many methods that are used in mainstream competition that have been proven in studies to cause substantial amounts of fear and are also abusive if you go by the default of causing pain and undue stress and basically terrorizing the being that you're working with? There's lots. What next? Fitness to compete. Participation in competition must be restricted to fit horses and athletes of proven competence. Horses must be allowed suitable rest period between training and competition. Additional rest periods should be allowed following traveling. What I also want to point out about this is that there's no actual statement of what they consider a suitable rest period. So it's left intentionally vague so that they can just be like, oh, well, in our opinion, that's a suitable rest period. What I also want to point out about this is I think it wasn't just literally just like this year in like April that Oliver Townend had like multiple almost really bad crashes because his horse was so exhausted. It was either at Badminton or Burley that he couldn't jump anymore, and they took forever to flag him and pull him off the course. And if the horse had crashed and injured itself, everyone would have had a problem with what was going on. And even still, some people were defending him. But like, if they waited so long that something way worse could have happened. And again, it violates their own code of conduct. Misuse of aids, abuse of a horse using natural riding aids or artificial aids will not be tolerated. Again, we see this happening all the time. And interestingly, one of the only super specific welfare codes that they have is about pregnant/recently foaled mares. Mares must not compete after their 4th month of pregnancy or with a foal at foot. And this is a really funny rule, in my opinion, because at 4 months of pregnancy, mares aren't even showing. They don't usually start showing that they're even pregnant and being obviously pregnant until like 7, 8, 9 months. So it's a really weird thing to do to bar competition at the 4th month, and then enable all the other things that they allow to happen from a welfare standpoint. Yeah, so basically there's you can look it up if you want to read it in full, but there are multiple things that they are directly in violation for that they have chosen to put in their own welfare code of conduct. And it's gross because they're openly and without guilt stating that they stand for certain practices and then not following those things. And I cannot stress enough how much more they're actually aware of than what we've been able to openly prove, because this is an issue that is so multifaceted and so enabled by so many different organizations and industries. Like the media industry also contributes to all of what we see going on being enabled in the show rings, because they enable normalization of certain horse traits that are correlated with stress or pain and just shrug it off as an issue. So there's so many people that are at fault. I would blame the media. I would blame bystanders and competitors that are watching what's happening and don't do anything. I would blame the judges. I would blame the stewards. I would blame the organization boards like the FEI and all of the people who are working to actually create the codes of conduct that they have and then not training people how to enforce them. The other thing is that with their own stewards, and they admitted to this in Paris, they do not have any standard of training during the time where you're testing to be a steward, where you're learning about horse behavior, where you're learning what a stressed horse looks like, what a horse who's in pain looks like, where they're learning how to identify what a lame horse looks like. They don't teach them any of that stuff. So how are they supposed to, even if they want to, how are they supposed to properly enforce something that they've never been taught to do? And I want to just add like a kind of footnote there that I think that a lot of times stewards are aware that what's going on is wrong and choose to look away. But with that said, there'd be far more accountability if you were actually training these people to definitively prove that they have the knowledge to point out what a stressed horse looks like, point out what rollker is, etc. So it's just such a like it's so frustrating to me, and like I know I sound like a broken record because like I've been talking about this for like years now, but I can't stop being so frustrated by how many people just allow this to keep happening. And it's like everyday people. It's everyday horse people who love horses who aren't FEI competitors, but they participate in allowing these practices to continue by not speaking out and also by normalizing the very attitudes that allow these practices to continue. And it's so frustrating to me, and it goes so far beyond the horse world, like to the point where it's like exhausting to really take it in how much corruption and mistreatment is openly enabled in so many different industries across the world. But I can't understand how people who say that they're compassionate, empathetic people who love their horses can be offered information that shows why something is wrong and why we shouldn't do it, and just continue to look away and allow it to keep happening, or justify what's going on because so and so's an upper level rider who has ridden at Grand Prix level. Have you ridden at Grand Prix level? And they deflect. Because here's the thing, you don't need to compete Grand Prix or at any FEI level to be able to know when a horse is uncomfortable or stressed. You don't. Like what I would argue is competing up to that level without doing an additional behavior education actually limits your ability to tell when horses are stressed, because you're around so many stressed horses that it feels normal. So it's like it's not a good gauge of what is being measured. Could they ride like a Grand Prix dressage test better than I can? Absolutely. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about horse welfare. And generally speaking, the people who are mocked the most because we've made the choice to not show to that level, um, and generally speaking, don't want to. Like, there's a reason why so many people who go into welfare discussion and horse behavior don't want to show anymore, because it creates such a strong compassion fatigue. And or if they do show, they've lost their prior goals of wanting to compete at the upper levels because of how abusive it is, because it's exhausting to be immersed in that environment and be so aware of what's wrong and just helpless to stop it. So people like myself and other people who have studied animal behavior and who are speaking out about welfare issues in the horse world are often criticized, degraded, and mocked for the levels that we have not yet competed to. But that's not what we're measuring. And what I also want to point out is like, I wouldn't, like, I mean, actually, I might in certain situations, but I am like woefully more educated on horse behavior and equine sciences than the average FEI competitor. And that's just a fact because we've chosen different paths in our lives. And a lot of them don't pursue a horse behavior or welfare centered education. But I have. And yet, people still put my expertise aside to defer to someone who has not studied equine sciences at any point and say that they are the better judge of what is healthy horse treatment. And what I want to point out is I think people are aware of the logical fallacies involved in doing that, because I think that's why they get so mad when they're constantly having to look at posts that conflict with the belief that they want to hold. They get frustrated because deep down they know that there is flaws in their logic, because otherwise, like, if you're sure that you're right, you don't really need to be as triggered about these things as people are. Like, I have people who don't follow me but routinely search up my name in their search bar to come onto my account and argue on my posts for no reason while complaining that I'm shoving opinions down their throat. Meanwhile, they are going onto my pages. And that's the other thing, is there's this implication that any discussion of horse welfare or discussion of any uncomfortable topic is shoving it down people's throat, even when you post it on your own pages, even when they only see it because they follow you or go to your page. And essentially what that means is that they're basically saying anything that makes them uncomfortable if they have to see it in any capacity, that you're shoving it down their throat, to which the only solution is just not talking about it. And that's what people want. That's why they try to pressure, coerce, and shame people into shutting up. um like, I've even had people like threaten me before, and it's just like, it's ridiculous, like the level of like manipulation, abuse tactics, and violence, be it like psychological or physical, that people are willing to enact to uphold the status quo when it is damaging, is insane. Absolutely crazy to me. And it's exhausting. Like, honestly, like I'm so tired going online every day, and like I still don't complain and say that people are shoving these things down my throat because I'm bombarded with them. Like, I can't follow any equine magazine, any horse brand, generally speaking, without being shown videos of stressed horses, oftentimes being ridden in really harsh contraptions. And I still don't really complain about it being shoved down my throat, because ultimately it's a choice for me to follow these pages, but it's such a pervasive attitude that I can't escape it. I have to see it everywhere I go. And I see the apathy of the general human population and the disconnect that they have from how their actions or lack thereof impact the people and the animals that they love. And I see it everywhere. And it's exhausting. And the thing that sucks the most is that if more people did take the initiative to participate in advocacy and move for positive change, it would be a lot less exhausting for everyone involved. We wouldn't have to work so hard, and we'd also get heard more because there'd be more people advocating for change. And the crowd has been growing for sure over the years. Like, it's definitely gotten better, but it's so exhausting to be so aware of like how wrong things have gone, and how turned off people are to the abuse that they inflict on horses or other people or themselves, and how normalized we've made it. Like, it's almost like less normal to point out the fact that something is harmful, and people want you to stop doing that. It's made less comfortable to be the person that's the whistleblower than it is to be the person actively participating in abuse. And it's so frustrating to watch because it's just everywhere. And like, I can't escape it by just pulling out of the horse world and like not being on horse social media, because the same attitude is in every single industry everywhere. We're seeing it happen right now in the world, where people feel so inconvenienced by protests that at its core is about human rights and humanitarian efforts. They feel so inconvenienced about it interrupting like their holiday or their commute to work, that they complain about the inconvenience that these people pose, that mildly inconveniences their day, mind you, because they're still very privileged. And they make it all about them. They center themselves, when a lot of these protests are centering humanitarian issues where people are suffering way more. But the inconvenience it poses to the everyday person who'd rather go around blissfully unaware of what's going on in the world, not having to take it in and acknowledge the role that they may or may not play in it, they get frustrated and they don't want to talk. They don't want to talk, like have to even look at it. They want to be completely shut off and not have to even see it going on. And again, exists in and out of the horse world. And that's why people get so mad when you speak out about these things. I have been subjected to probably the most like abuse that I ever have online, which is honestly saying something, because like I've been online for a while and people are freaking nasty when they're behind the screen. Simply because I've posted about a ceasefire, and like I just want to point out how incredibly fucked up it is that people view it as an act of violence to show compassion towards all humans and not want to see ongoing war throughout the world. And the fact that it's trying to frame that as an act of violence, when at its core it is about preserving human life and not promoting violence, is the most manipulative, gaslighty bullshit that I have seen in a while. And what I would like to point out to people as well when you're consuming media is anything that tries to draw such a strong division between sides, where it's like you can either support this side and hate this other side, or support this side and hate that side, probably propaganda. And I wanna point out, like, in reference to what I'm talking about, with the ceasefire in Gaza is, people telling me that I promote terrorism for saying, like, "Hey, let's not keep bombing these people who are living in poverty and where 20,000 people have died." And it's referenced as being violent, despite the fact that the people telling me that are the ones that are like, "Yeah, keep bombing children." Um, and that is so propagandized to make it out to be where it's like you cannot have compassion for people who are being harmed at all without it personally attacking the other side. And that is messed up because it's dehumanizing a group of people to give preference to the other group. Whereas I have not seen any dehumanization at any of the protests that I've been at from anyone else. So, and like this isn't related to horses, but the reason why I want to point that out in specific is because like people aren't aware of the propaganda they're consuming, be it in the horse world or otherwise. They're not aware of when they're being manipulated. And I think the most dangerous thing that anyone can have mindset wise is the belief that they can never be manipulated, that they can never be subject to propaganda, because then they don't even question whatever they believe. Because if they believe it, it comes with the assumption that it couldn't possibly be manipulative because they believe in it. And this is the case for so many people. And it's oftentimes easier to buy into whatever media is most central in your area and what your family believes, what your friends believe. Because if you choose to take a different stance than people around you, you're inevitably going to create conflict. There's really no way around it. If you take especially when it's ethics based, you're going to piss people off. So a lot of people choose the easy road of just trying to coexist and go with the flow and match the energy and belief system of people around them, even when it defies their own ethics and morals that they have, because they don't want conflict. But what I want to say is that if you do that to yourself and you know in your core that what you're witnessing is wrong and that those around you that enable it, even if you like them as people in other ways, are enabling something that you know is wrong, but you want to avoid the conflict with those people, the conflicts that you're going to have internally is still going to be really damaging. And sometimes it is way more worthwhile to rock the boat and stand for what you believe in than it is to basically sell out and defy your own beliefs and let yourself down in preference of making other people comfortable. And it's kind of like loaded coming from me a little bit because like I have lost friends and I've created conflict with family members with my views being so open, but I honestly don't really regret it. Like there's a few things that I've done now where I've been a little concerned about how they would be received because I knew that it was going to be like a contentious topic, especially relating to family members, because that's harder to separate yourself from than social media. But I don't regret it because it's always worked out in the end, and it allows me to be authentic to myself and my own belief system and advocate for people that need it, or be openly talking about people who are taking advantage of other human beings in the way that needs to be said. Um, Sorry, I'm using really vague language right now. I'm going to try to give a better example. What I've done in reference to my family is when I wrote my book, I openly named my uncle who financially screwed over a huge portion of the family and embezzled millions of dollars from people, and put my family into bankruptcy several, like, I don't know, over a decade ago now. I named him and called him out in the book because I wanted to, and I wanted him to, if he ever sees it, to know, like, hey, you created a defining moment in my life that led to a lot of trauma and heartache and hurt, but I have risen from it and become a better person because of it. And I will never be like you because of it. I'm never going to take advantage of people like you did, because from your cruelty, I learned more kindness. And I was scared to openly call him out in the blunt way that I did because I was worried about how it might be received by family. Because a lot of them like to sweep things under the rug and kind of do what I was saying, where you try to coexist and try to keep the peace and be comfortable. And honestly, I got feedback that surprised me where people were like, good for you. I'm so glad that you did that because no one else is willing to. And I've also found that in other situations where I've had people, generally speaking, they'll privately thank me because they don't want to get like attacked in the comment section. And say that I've given them the confidence to have more of a voice and advocate for their horse or advocate for themselves, or recognize that the situation they're in at their barn or otherwise is toxic and abusive. And in doing so for those vulnerable people and animals, I am doing a way greater act of good for them by far than what I would offer by just allowing people their comfort and ignoring things. And that's something that I'm really grateful for, that I'm going to continue to try to perpetuate, because growing up, there was a lot of times where I felt like I was alone, where no one had my back and where my voice was unheard, and where I had no one to really advocate for me or help me out of situations where I felt stuck, trapped, and uncomfortable. So with my platforms, what I try to do is try to reach people like that. And generally speaking, the people who are the most lit up by what I say, where they're the most furious, they're not coming from those vulnerable, marginalized groups. Or if they do, they come back later and they're like, thank you. I've been able to discover parts of myself that were having problems. And I think that's important. And like, I would encourage everyone in the horse industry to try to look at problems like that. Like if you see on like something that you feel is unfair to the horse or abusive going on, and you try to put yourself in the horse's shoes, or think about if that were happening to your horse, how would you want to handle it? I would encourage you to handle every situation like that. If you were the person or the animal getting abused, what would you want other people to do for you? Would you want them to advocate and be your voice? Would you want them to help you out of that situation? Or would you want them to turn and look away and turn a blind eye and keep you perpetually in that situation until someone else is willing to be your voice? And I think we all know the answer to that, because no one wants to be trapped in an abusive situation where they have no voice. And that is kind of the motto, like the type of attitude that I try to bring to everything that I speak out about, and then everything that I put on my platform is I go, if I happen to be in a situation like this, how would I want people to respond? Because a lot of the situations that we end up in are just about privilege and luck. I didn't make the conscious choice to choose to be born in Canada, but I'm here and it's a pretty safe place to live, and I have a roof over my head, and I'm safe, and I have family and friends, and I'm fortunate in that way. I don't have to worry about being imminently in danger. I'm not living in a war-torn country. I'm not living in poverty. I didn't choose to be where I was. It's just where I ended up. And similarly with like people and animals who find themselves in situations that are really damaging to welfare, they don't choose to be in those situations. Generally speaking, they don't. Um, Even with issues like addiction, people who are addicted to substances don't consciously choose to be addicted, which is the entire problem about addiction. It is it comes out of trauma. It's an illness, it's a disease, it's a mental health disorder, in the same way so many other mental health problems are. They don't make the conscious choice to do that. And I think the way that we kind of shrug everything off and we're like, oh, well, they chose to put them in that situation, they deserve it, and shrug off our humanity is really problematic. And it also trains us and primes us to care about things less in situations with animals as well. It's not just about people. Um, and the other thing too is that, like, when you can practice, like, it definitely sucks a little bit sometimes to have so much empathy that you're well aware of, like, the problems of the world and how they impact creatures around you. Um, but at the same time, I wouldn't trade that for having my humanity be so turned off that I wasn't feeling the whole human experience of having all these emotions and being able to interconnect with horses and people and be able to like put myself in their shoes and try to level with and understand what they're going through. I wouldn't trade it for that, even though it causes me some grief and it's difficult. Uh, and I would encourage everyone to do the same. And in doing these lives, I just hope to be able to use the time to talk about things more in a way that might resonate with people, so so should they choose to listen. And that's why I do them on Instagram and YouTube or Facebook, because they save and then people can watch them after. But I don't know. That's the type of attitude I would ask people to approach any type of welfare issue with, is how would you want people to advocate for you if you were the one who is experiencing abuse or toxicity or whatever. um and With horses, I think that if we are being really honest with ourselves and we put ourselves in their shoes and just think about from the standpoint of being a mammal with a nervous system, how would this make me feel? Unless we're lying to ourselves, a lot of times the answer is very clear. Like for people who defend things like lip chains and twitches and insist that they don't cause pain, just put yourself in that position because like we mammals have very similar nervous systems. And generally speaking, their bodies work in very similar ways, including the pain receptors. So not to anthropomorphize horses, but there's really no reason to believe that they don't have the same capacity to feel pain as we do. And a lot of the things that we do to them should kind of be a no-brainer that they cause pain because it would cause us pain if we were in the same situation. And yet we've turned off the ability to really address that and reflect on it and be honest with ourselves about it. Because it's more comfortable to do so. That's really the only reason why. It doesn't actually have anything to do with what's accurate and what's the most likely. It has to do with what makes us the most comfortable so we can continue doing what we're doing without change and not feel guilty about it. The last thing that I'm going to leave people off with is to say that, like, when you make the choice to try to change the way you perceive horses and thereby change the way you participate in the industry and how you exist around horses, it's not an easy shift because it requires a full change in your mindset to the extent that I don't think people can really even anticipate until they start doing it. Like if you'd asked me a few years ago if I'd become like as like granola or hippie as I have as like that, and I'm using quotes because I don't think that's actually what it is. I just think it's compassion. I would probably laugh at it and say no. But the further I committed to learning certain things and trying to unlearn toxic behaviors, the more it demanded change from myself. And the more I had to reflect on the way that I used to do things and decide whether or not I wanted to keep doing that. And it made it impossible to really be in denial about the way I impacted the horses that I worked with and how I had enabled some toxic training methods and how I had caused harm. I couldn't ignore it because in doing so, I'd have to literally look at information that is right in my face, proving me wrong, and just be like, no, I'm not going to listen to this. So it's led me down a rabbit hole where I've learned so much more about horses and myself, and I've learned how to appreciate them way more because I have learned how to enjoy just existing with them. It's become less about the competition, less about the riding. And I've learned how to just enjoy just being, which has brought me more happiness too, because then my enjoyment of my horses isn't conditional on their use as riding horses. I can enjoy them regardless. So that doesn't mean that I wouldn't be sad if they had an injury that rendered them unable to do that, but it's less important to me now. My happiness isn't contingent on being able to ride them. And that brought me a lot of peace. And also in studying human psychology and the psychology of trauma and how people respond and interact with each other, it's changed my perspective on myself, but also on other people because I used to be so much more insecure and I took things highly personally. And now I realize that a lot of the ways in which people treat us are actually about themselves. It's not actually like anything to do with you. And the horse world, especially, I think that we enable a lot of bullying behavior even from trainers because we call it like tough love and we just say that it's like a necessary part of growth and learning as a rider. And that's what I grew up with because I started riding at 4. And it made me really insecure, but I've recognized now that there's so many different ways to educate people and animals that don't involve using harsh punishment, that don't involve using coercion, that don't involve scaring them. And when we keep them in a non-elevated state and they're not in fight or flight mode, they actually learn better. And that's completely changed how I perceive everything. So anyways, it's not a comfortable journey, but it's a worthwhile one, and hopefully more people start taking it because I think it's a necessary thing that the horse world absolutely needs if we want to maintain it the way as it is. I don't think that the horse world is going to last competitively if we don't make changes. I think that we're at a tipping point where we have a choice as a community on what we want to do, how we want to go forward, how we want the future to be. And I think it would be really foolish for people to be so set in their ways that they just refuse to make changes and refuse to consider how normalized practices could be damaging to our own detriment, because people are becoming more and more like literate of like studies and learning how to find credible sources. And there's more and more studies coming out about horses that expose things that horse people try to convince each other aren't problematic. And realistically, it's only going to last where people who are in the industry and they either just want to cling on to what they feel comfortable with, or they blindly believe what their mentors tell them. They're really the only ones who are going to continue believing these things. People on the outside of the horse world don't care about maintaining the sport because they don't fully realize the amount of fallout behavior it would have if we have all these horses who no longer have homes and all these people who are losing jobs. They don't think about that. They have no stake in the game. They have nothing to lose. They just look at how we handle our animals and make a decision based off of that and the information available to tell them whether or not it is or is not ethical. So we're at a moral tipping point as an industry, and this Andreas Helgstrand situation is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the enabled abuse in the community. Because, like, to be frank, um, even just within my local community, like, I've I've personally seen a lot of abuse behind the scenes, um, especially growing up, and it's hard because if you don't document it, you can't really prove that it's happened, and it's your word against them, especially if they're well known in the community. Um, and even in the more upper level communities, I've heard about a lot of abuse, and there's a lot of similar tactics that are used by different trainers to train horses and try to speed things up. Um, and honestly, like, I think that it's way more prevalent than what people are ready to admit at this point. Like, it's so entrenched and ingrained in our culture. And people will say someone like me is overreacting when I point out like that we shouldn't be laughing at our horses having hard times in videos, and that like it's not funny when they're panicking and like da 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 da. But that is part of the desensitization process to disconnect from what it is that you're actually doing. If you can consume all of these videos of terrified animals who are endangering themselves in their massive panic to evade what their trainer is doing to them, and laugh at it and just be like, oh, they're so extra, or they're so this, they're so that, you have effectively desensitized yourself to what it is you're actually doing, because you're causing a creature distress and terror to a high extent and you're mocking them. And it's so prevalent in the horse world. Like, even if you just go on TikTok and you look at the most popular horse videos, so many of them are stressed horses or horses who are exhibiting pain behaviors. And if you point that out, you're called a buzzkill. And people are like, oh, like you're such a hippy dippy, blah, blah, blah. And they'll insult you and who you are, rather than considering that maybe they're doing something harmful. And like it is hard to accept it. Like, when people point that out, definitely is. But there's this narrative that people who are noticing these harmful, toxic viewpoints in the horse world are just overreacting, and that they're keyboard warriors or that they're internet trainers, when a really good portion of them are humans that have made the choice to become educated on the science behind behavior and are very concerned as a result. And it's a cop out when you just insist that anyone who doesn't agree with you is a keyboard warrior and must not know anything or has never trained a horse like that. And there's a playbook that the people who are defending these things operate off of, and they almost always use the same tactics. And it's all related to assuming someone's level of knowledge and then degrading what you assume their knowledge to be and what you assume their experience to be. The amount of people who told me that I've never started a horse, or like, do you even train horses, or like, you've never worked with a horse this difficult, and they say all these things because I don't have these videos of horses blowing up to that extent because I train to avoid those things. But they've decided that there's no way to handle horses without doing that. And I think that's what's so alarming, is the belief that this is a necessary part of handling horses, that you can't avoid repeatedly having that level of stress show up in your training program. And it's not about perfection, because sometimes stuff happens and you can't avoid it. But there's a huge difference between someone making a mistake, seeing how it impacts the horse they're working with, and going, wow, I sent them way over threshold. That's not ideal. That's pretty dangerous. They're pretty stressed. And learning from it, and someone who's laughing and going, oh, what a rank horse. What an extra horse. This horse is crazy. And just shrugging it off, completely blaming the horse, and then not changing anything they do because they've now made the assumption that it's just the way the horse is. And that's the type of logic that we see so many people using, where they'll shrug it off and they'll justify certain levels of cruelty towards horses that they have problems with as a trainer, when they are the issue. But the horse becomes blamed, and they use the horse's temperament and their incompatibility with their training system as a reason to justify continuing to stress out that animal, when really it's actually about them. And what we need to do is we need to look internally. Is if you're perpetually setting horses off, then that means that repeatedly you're doing things that are highly stressful to a flight animal, and you've not learned to do things differently. And like, people who have followed me for a while would have seen like a lot of my old videos where there's like definitely lots of stressed horses, so they can like speak for the fact that I've dealt with them. But the reason why in recent years that's not happening is because I've learned to not trigger them to that extent. And it's also safer for me. It's not even just about the horse welfare. Like, that's a huge part of it, but I just don't see the point in putting myself in situations that are way more dangerous than they need to be, when it's detrimental to the horse and potentially detrimental to me and my career and my ability to continue showing up to the barn. I don't see the point. And people can call me a chicken for that, but it like, that's like their own insecurity coming out, where they've been goaded and bullied into feeling like they need to prove something, and that they need to be able to ride through all these stress behaviors in a horse in order to be a valid and relevant trainer, when usually you can honestly fix a lot of stress behaviors from the ground. So like, anyone who gets nervous riding stressed horses and gets off to do groundwork with them, I want you to feel validated right now, because that's a perfectly acceptable decision to make, and you absolutely can alter your horse's behavior and make them better and avoid problems in the future by working them on the ground. And frankly, it's a better decision to do than to get on them when you're scared and when they're scared and put yourself and them in danger. The groundwork makes sense. It actually really helps. The entire notion that you need to get back on the horse when you fall is so damaging, because it causes riders to get back on when they've fallen off and potentially injured themselves, and when the horse might need like a reset mentally. But there's this idea that if you don't do that, that the horse gets away with it. When in actuality, by the time you get back on the horse, they're not going to associate your getting back on with what they did. It's too far apart. Hello, Scout. So it's all based in like superstition and like really old school belief systems that aren't actually particularly accurate. So it would be lovely to encourage people to use like kinder, softer methods for their horses and for themselves, and to keep horses and people safer. And that's also part of the reason why I'm so vocal about this, because I see so many promising young riders put into dangerous situations by trainers and other people that they trust, and get super injured when it's completely unnecessary and when they could learn a better way of doing things. Or they end up being like put off of being in the horse industry because they've been so uncomfortable and so scared in situations that they don't want to keep doing them, and it impacts their progress as a rider. Um, and changing that would be nice, because we'd see less injuries in riders, and we'd also see less injuries in horses. And I'm assuming that also that a lot of the health issues that we see in horses wouldn't be as prevalent, because with people, it's a known fact that stress is very expensive on the body and that it can create a lot of physical issues. And we should kind of be taking that logic into everything that we do, because there's not really any reason to believe that it doesn't hold true with other animals just because we haven't openly studied it. Anyways, Instagram is telling me I only have 40 seconds left because I guess they've changed it where you can only go live for an hour. So I'm going to end the Instagram live. I'm just going to let it end itself in like 30 seconds. But yeah, so I don't know. That's my TED talk. People can listen to it. And honestly, this applies to everything outside of the horse world. And it's just very relevant and current because we've created a planet where everyone is so individualistic that they've stopped caring about how other people suffer, and they've separated themselves so far from people suffering and animal suffering that they can directly participate and enable it. And thank you. Instagram's going to cancel this, but I'm still on YouTube. So, oops. Okay. Uh-oh, that didn't let me save it. So I guess we're going to just save it on YouTube. But yeah, anyways, thank you to everyone who listened. I might do like a different filmed video of like some of the photos from the Helgstrand documentary. I don't think I can really take clips because I think it would go against Creative Commons. But I'll try to put something together soon to talk about it more directly. But honestly, like what I cannot stress enough is that these issues are prevalent in every discipline of the horse world and in so many riders within those disciplines. They are not uncommon at the upper levels. In fact, they are exceedingly common. And we really need to, as a community, accept that fact and work to change it if we don't like what it says about us, rather than just ignoring it and denying it, because that's not a real solution. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening, everyone. And yeah, you can watch this if you missed the beginning. It'll save on my YouTube, and you should be able to just go back and watch it from the beginning. So thanks for listening, everybody, and have a good day.